welcome to the Foundation, and thank you very much for joining us. This is a greeting for those who are virtual as well as those who are here in the building right now. Everybody attending the event virtually, I just wanted to mention that if a question arises over the course of our conversation today and you'd like to submit one to Andres, please just, you can send it by WhatsApp or by the email address that is listed at the website, and I'll receive a tablet during the Q&A session, and we can pose the question directly. It's a great pleasure and delight to be here today with Andres Neumann, I think one of Latin America's most versatile and interesting young writers. He is the author of many volumes of poetry, of short fiction, and at least 6 novels in Spanish already at this point, many of which have been translated into multiple languages around the world. He's been recognized both within the Hispanophone world as well as in other languages. Within English, he has been listed among Granta's best young Spanish language writers, and the Bogota 39, which is also a list of writers of terrific promise under 40 from many years ago. And he has a new novel, and that's why we're here today. This is a book called Fracture, which we're going to be discussing in our conversation, and it's been published in English and in French. I just want to mention for those who are here that both of those editions are available upstairs. Yeah, I was thinking maybe without saying too much in advance about the novel and the way it's structured and the way that it's formed, while we were in the car coming up here, a Polish poet was mentioned, Wisława Szymborska, and this book actually begins with an epigraph by another great Nobel Prize-winning post-war Polish poet, Czesław Miłosz. And do you want to say something about that particular epigraph? Because I find it representative of where the book goes.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. It's a great pleasure for me to have this conversation with you. And thank you for coming, for those who are behind the screens, if they are awakened. I mean, this is Sunday morning, so you shouldn't be there, but if you are, thank you. Yes, it's like poetry says it all in advance, right? And narration only needs to develop poetical ideas that were previously written somehow. And in this case, yes, Miłosz said, if something happens somewhere, if something exists somewhere, it will exist everywhere. And this was written way before the pandemic. Yeah. For instance, you can sum it up just through this line. And this viral nature of human activity, I think it fits very well the atomic issue, and it summarizes the 3 main forces that lead our lives, the borderless forces that lead our lives: love, energy, and money. And those are the three topics that are inside the novel. And I remember I was living that particular year, 2011, in Paris for work reasons, and it was the 11th March when, you know, the Fukushima accident, tsunami, the earthquake, which led to the tsunami, which led to the atomic accident at Fukushima plant. And I was living in Paris, half horrified, half fascinated by the images of yet again nuclear cloud, when I suddenly stopped and thought, so I am an Argentinian person who was educated in Spain, and the 11th March was the anniversary for the Atocha bombs attacks, so I was very aware of the date. So I'm an Argentinian person raised in Spain, living in France, watching a Japanese accident. So where am I? Where is this happening really? And I immediately thought of that line. And that kind of started the whole story. I needed someone who seemed to live everywhere and being like a collective character. Someone who lived virtually everywhere because he endured something that could have happened everywhere. And the next day after the accident at Fukushima, I read in the newspaper something that moved me, no pun intended, moved me, because apparently the axis of the planet had shifted by a few centimeters after the Japanese earthquake. The axis moved like 10 centimeters, 12 centimeters, so the whole planet had literally been shaken by this event. And indeed, these kind of nuclear events like Fukushima or Chernobyl could have easily damaged the whole planet. So I thought it was a good starting point to think about the story.
It's interesting too, because there's this notion of being somewhere but everywhere at the same point. You know, on the one hand, you've described yourself, an Argentinian raised partly in Spain, you know, in Paris, experiencing this historical moment in 2011. And when that was transmuted into a fiction, the character around which this novel is structured is not an Argentinian in Paris. It's, in fact, it's a Japanese man, Yoshi Watanabe, who is the principal character around which this novel has been structured. What led you to think of him as a particular, I mean, obviously there's a connection to Japan, Fukushima, that kind of alignment came into place. Can you say a little bit more about the conception of this character and how that arose?
Well, in first place, there's again the poetry, because there's a poet that I love very much, and probably Jorge has read him, is Jose Watanabe, the Peruvian poet. He was he was born in Peru, and his father, I think, was Japanese, and his mother was a Peruvian. And in his poetry, Jose Watanabe, you can see both distant shores reunited. I mean, he's very Latin American, but at the same time, you can definitely see the Japanese poetical sensitivity. So I invented this character named Watanabe, which is a common name, pretty usual name in Japan. So almost everybody can have that name in Japan, Watanabe. In English, if you think about that name, it's like want to be someone else. So I was interested in the sound of the name, and I was interested in the notion of distant places that become suddenly neighbors. And if you think about Argentina, precisely, Japan is the furthest you can go. They are antipodes. Yeah. So something that we shouldn't care about because it happened in China, it's just a virus in China, or just an earthquake in Japan, can affect your land. So what I was trying to tell a story where the most remote places are affected by something that happens apparently in a very distant place. And I was also interested in exploring the notion of translation, which is one of my obsessions. I mean, my novels talk about translation all the time. Mm-hmm. And how can you translate distant cultural frames? How does it feel to learn Spanish if you're Japanese? So the grammar, the alphabet, I mean, everything changes, not only the language, but the logic. So what remains when you try to translate a distant culture? So precisely, I need a very foreign character for me. But of course, my Japanese character is not a samurai or a typical Japanese, because I'm not entitled to know about that. He's precisely a Japanese who feels foreigner in Japan, because he has lived all of his life abroad. And I can relate to the idea of migration and exile myself. So it's like a Japanese experiment for my own displacement experience, so to speak.
Maybe we can introduce those who are unfamiliar with the book to Monsieur Watanabe by a little reading from very early on in the novel, in which you can perhaps recite a passage in Spanish, and then I'll proceed to read the
Certainly.
Translation of that moment. This is a scene at the very opening of the book, which is quite powerful and quite moving, which is set precisely on that morning that you marked as a kind of impetus and conceptual moment. It's the earthquake itself, and Mr. Watanabe is basically experiences it underground and makes his way back to, very gradually, back to his apartment, tentatively. And so this scene is when he returns to the apartment itself.
Yeah, and you know, the epicenter of the earthquake wasn't at Tokyo. So Tokyo felt the earthquake, but it wasn't any serious damage. So he's coming back home thinking it wasn't serious, and he's just about to hear what happened in the northeast of the country. So he's just about to know the tragic news. And he feels something is wrong, but he doesn't know what it is. His house is almost perfect. A few things moved a bit. So it's the sensation of something might have happened somewhere else, which sets the tone for the novel. And of course, I wanted to say that, of course, Japan, the same way as Germany, for example, some points of the history pretty much summarize the human capacity for self-destruction and reconstruction.
Yeah.
Of course, and if you think about Japan being destroyed in the Second World War till the very end, I mean, once the Nazis had resigned, or I don't know what's the word in English.
Capitulated.
Yeah, exactly. Japan continued fighting because they were the very last to be defeated. And at the same time, the reconstruction was very quick, was super quick. For example, when Hiroshima suffered the bomb, even before the war ended, 2 days later, the trains were working towards Nagasaki. But the reconstruction of Japan was done partly thanks to the nuclear energy, the atomic plants, which was the energy that had destroyed them. So this strange balance, which I find moving and human, and every single country is addicted in a way, and relying on the force that destroyed them. So in a way, that part of the Japanese history is like a laboratory for the human nature, in a way. So Mr. Watanabe enters his apartment feeling that something might be wrong, and this is what happens. He has a collection of banjos, and the first thing he sees is some of them have fallen on the floor. Desde el instante mismo en que pisa la sala, intuye que algo no va bien. En su condición de maniático sabe que cada espacio posee un equilibrio secreto y cualquier desajuste puede perturbarlo. Algunos de los muebles se han movido levemente, lo cual confirma que ha sido un terremoto más violento de lo usual. Watanabe avanza como un detective que investiga el crimen cometido en su propia habitación. De inmediato divisa el estropicio en su colección de banjos. Algunos se han descolgado de los soportes y yacen sobre la tarima. Varias cuerdas se han soltado de sus puentes. Los mástiles apuntan en todas direcciones, señalando a múltiples culpables. Las cajas de resonancia cantan infinitesimalmente su caída. El señor Watanabe contempla ese catálogo de instrumentos derrocados. Se agacha a examinarlos y los cuelga. Ninguno parece haber sufrido daños irreparables. Ahora bien, ¿hasta qué punto un daño es reparable? ¿No valdría la pena hacer algo diferente? ¿Por qué disimular los desperfectos en sus banjos y no integrarlos en su restauración? Todas las cosas rotas, piensa, tienen algo en común. Una grieta las une a su pasado. Acaricia uno por uno los instrumentos que se han salvado del desplome. Tiene la convicción de que los objetos que han estado a punto de romperse por cualquier motivo, de resbalar, caer, partirse, chocar con otros, ingresan en una segunda vida, en un estado anfibio que los vuelve significativos, imposibles de tocar, igual que antes.
This is from the translation into English by Nick Kester and Lorenza Garcia. From the very moment he steps into the living room, he senses that something isn't right. As an obsessive, he knows that each space possesses a secret equilibrium which any imbalance can disturb. Some of the furniture is moved slightly, a confirmation that this earthquake was more powerful than usual. Watanabe advances like a detective investigating the crime committed in his own room. He instantly notices the disarray among his collection of banjos. Some have slipped off their stands and are lying on the floor. A few strings have come off from the bridges. The necks are pointing every which way, hinting at multiple culprits. The sound boxes sing infinitesimally of their fall. Mr. Watanabe contemplates this catalog of toppled instruments. He stoops to examine them, then puts them back in place. None appears to have suffered irreparable damage, but then, he corrects himself, to what extent is damage reparable? Wouldn't it be worth doing something different? Why hide the imperfections in his banjos? Why not incorporate them into the restoration? All broken objects, he reflects, have something in common. A crack joins them to their past. One by one, he caresses the instruments that have survived the toppling. He's convinced that things which have been on the verge of breaking for whatever reason, slipping, falling, smashing, colliding with one another, enter a second life, an amphibious state that makes them meaningful, impossible to touch in the same way as before. This explains perhaps his growing admiration for the ancient art of kintsugi. When a piece of pottery breaks, the kintsugi craftspeople place powdered gold into each crack to emphasize the spot where the break occurred. Exposed rather than concealed, these fractures and their repair occupy a central place in the history of the object. By accentuating this memory, it is ennobled. Something that has survived damage can be considered more valuable, more beautiful. It's a beautiful passage, it's a beautiful idea, and I think it's one that's very representative, not just for broader themes in the book, but even just this protagonist's psyche. Because of course, if the book begins with a disaster, there's a disaster before the disaster, and there's one that links them intimately, which is namely Hiroshima, of which
he survived.
He is a survivor, right?
When he was a child.
And this is apparently, from what I understand, this is also based, I had no idea that this was the case, and it's not an identical situation, but that there's a historical individual who not only survived Hiroshima, it sounds like a Jewish joke or a cruel joke or an Eastern European joke, but then also survived Nagasaki afterwards. You spared that fate of this protagonist, at least because he misses the train.
I changed it slightly, yes, exactly. Yeah, he's, I mean, the historical character you're mentioning, to me, is one of the most amazing human beings that ever lived on Earth. It was named Tsutomu Yamaguchi, and this man is one of the few people, there were a few hundreds that survived not one, but the two atomic bombs, because they were in Hiroshima working, and probably they lived in Nagasaki. So you know, they managed to survive the bomb, catch one of the first trains back to Nagasaki just in time to be bombed again and surviving. But Yamaguchi was the only one, just him, who lived long enough to be acknowledged by the Japanese authorities as an official survivor of both bombs, because it took a long time for the Japanese authorities, you know, to approach, to embrace their historical traumatic memory, just like every single country. I mean, you name it. France and their collaboration with the Nazis, you know, l'État français, the Vichy, tout ça. You know, Argentina with a post-dictatorship.
Or even as we've been discussing, we've heard on the stage in the last few days, the colonial tradition in various countries, you know, that's something that's still, it's not even resolved.
Exactly, so every single country Watanabe lives in has a problem with their own memory. And this Yamaguchi survived both bombs and lived almost a century. He died when he was 93 years old, right before Fukushima accident. So he didn't see the repetition of history, luckily. He died thinking that no other nuclear cloud could be seen in Japan. So my character is like a variation, a fictional derivation of this historical character. Of course, Yamaguchi didn't live in Argentina, didn't live in Madrid. So I invented a whole life, starting with experience quite similar to Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi was a grown man when this happened, whereas my character was a child, so there are many differences. But I was interested in this Yamaguchi man because my question was, when you survive 2 atomic bombs and you live more than 90 years, are you more mortal or less mortal than normal human beings? Are you already dead? Are you a posthumous individual? Have you lost death? Do you feel you're immortal, or do you feel like a ghost? What kind of relationship you have with mortality after you should have died and you didn't? You know, all your people died, but you don't. You feel guilty, you feel lucky, you feel both? So to me, it was a very fascinating way of, again, like a microscope in the human nature. So I don't think that, I don't think that only in your country you can find the human questions that move you the most. Sometimes you need to travel far away to find your own questions.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because on the one hand, there are the scars on the body, the scars on his back from the initial explosion.
Yeah.
And that's something that some of the women he comes across over the course of the book and in these different cities that he lives in will all encounter: the skin, the outside, the body.
Yeah.
But of course, the trauma of those of that experience itself, and the memory of that experience is something that the damage, the fracture of that particular experience is something that is a work in progress throughout the entire novel. You can say throughout his entire lifetime, right? Yeah. And which matches nicely with that notion of kintsugi that you mentioned earlier, that of this kind of in which the fractures, in which the breaks.
Yeah, it's like, you know, the cover, the Spanish cover, you can see, you know, the golden line which is repairing something which is broken, and instead of concealing the crack, you highlight it, so you can remember you were broken forever. You repaired, not forgetting what happened. And I thought that it was a good metaphor for what we can do with our historical memory, because we're, in most of countries that I lived or read about, for some reason they give you a fake choice. It's like a totally toxic dichotomy between looking back to the past and looking ahead to the future, as 2 different opposite choices, right? Yeah. And kintsugi does both things at the same time. I mean, the object comes back to life. It's useful again. You can pour a liquid or rice again in this bowl or this cup. So it is present and future again. But this future is built based on the memory of what happened and the value of having survived. So in the Japanese market, a piece of pottery repaired by the technique of kintsugi costs more money than it costed before being broken. And I thought, well, that's powerful, but for some reason we're not able to apply this principle to people, or not to mention countries. So the novel is an experiment with the idea of applying kintsugi to political problems or emotional conflicts, because it's full of love stories. You know, the book, in every single city there's a love story at a different age, and the problem of how to communicate trauma in the different phases of our life. So Mr. Watanabe doesn't know when is the right moment to share your trauma. And most families have this question too, you know. Sometimes it's too early to talk about it, sometimes it's too late. And I read, I think it was a German or French sociologic essay where they say there were like three generational block about communicating collective traumas. Every single country goes through this process. The first generation that endured a trauma doesn't have the language to say what happened. I mean, if you survived an atomic bomb, you can't tell it because you don't know how to name it, and there's not the grammar for this. So it's unspeakable.
Yeah.
The second generation does have the language, there's perspective, time has passed, so you might be able to tell it, but it's kind of not the right moment. You're rebuilding, the country has been reconstructed, so it's not the right moment to go back to the past and the old scars, so it's inappropriate.
Yeah.
And then the third generation has the language, has the bibliography, it's not as painful now, but it's so far away that it seems like it cannot be repeated. So what's the point in telling the story? So now it's unthinkable.
Yeah.
So it's never the right moment to tell a trauma. And to me, literature is that parallel language that tries to tell the story that cannot be told.
It's too difficult to be told, yeah. And of course, this is something that is applicable not just to international conflicts, but it's I think immediately of civil war, of situations like the Spanish Civil War, also the way that generations don't talk about. On the one hand, you have the collective trauma, and then on the other hand, you have the personal trauma and those individual experiences within the family.
I mean, I do live in Granada, as you know.
Yeah.
And Lorca's body, just like hundreds of thousands of them, we don't know where they are until this day.
Yeah.
So yes, everywhere,
And
as me was put it.
And this book is interesting too because it's, on the one hand, we're talking about the epicenter in some respect if we're discussing like local historical traumas. So whether it's Hiroshima as experienced in Japan across several different generations, the interesting thing about the geographical range of this book and the cultural range and the historical range, because it essentially covers the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, and the beginning of the 21st century, is you also have these moments in which, for example, there's a scene, it must be in New York, with Laurie, I think, is it Laurie's brother? So this is one of his lovers after he Mr. Watanabe goes from Japan to Paris, and later he moves to New York. And
because he
when
works
he's in New York,
for a multinational company, audiovisual, sell televisions, radios, and he's moved by the company, and he basically is told to move to a new office.
Yeah, and there's this scene where a conversation about the atomic bomb and the justification for dropping the atomic bomb, as was common in American rhetoric in the 70s, 80s, 90s. This is very interesting in particular because at my university, a colleague who teaches in the history department, every year he asks the same question to his students: do you believe that dropping the atomic bomb was a war crime? And he said, only in the last 3 years, there's just been a huge shift in the percentage, and this was the first year where the majority said yes, right? So it's, I mean, on the one hand, you have the immediate perception of the collective trauma. This is, again, the same thing of like, you know, when something happens somewhere, it happens everywhere. Those reverberations.
Well, this is some other thing, because, I mean, I was interested in the Japanese historical memory because unlike, I mean, I have Jewish roots, right? And it's not the same to tell the story when you're the winner. I mean, your people has been killed, but your side has won the war. Yeah. But what about historical memory when you lost the war? You're even less allowed to tell the story of your people. So it's layers of silences and blocks. And of course, and in the same way, I mean, the same way that Japan wasn't too interested in hearing the story of their own survivors for a couple of decades. It was like not available, anyone was available to listen to their fellow Japanese stories. The same way, for the opposite reasons in America, schools and the people needed to convey the idea that it was necessary to drop those bombs because the good guys had won, right? So they couldn't have done such a terrible thing. It must have been necessary. Yeah. So they are opposite pedagogies, and both are based in silences.
Yeah, and they confront one another in this book within that historical context.
And those two stories very often happens in the same country. In Argentina or Spain, you can get these opposite versions of history and trauma depending on what side your family was, for example. So I'm really interested in what the narrative, the literary narrative, can do with these historical contradictions.
Yeah. I want to ask a question about a different form of art besides literature, since, well, I suppose this is literature too. Mr. Watanabe is
Everything is literature.
it's all literature. The damaged banjos is literature and so on. No, I was thinking about the fact that he also has, he's a businessman, but he's cultivated as well. And he knows all of these Zen poems, death poems, right, written by masters. And he knows them by heart.
Yeah.
That was one of these touching idiosyncrasies of the character. And I wonder how that made its way into your book, because I've read several, they're called like death koans or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Or Zen poems that are based on that, and they recur, right? They're quoted, he recites them, and it's an interesting way in which that is a text that when you learn something by heart, right, that becomes internalized.
Yeah.
It's that's something that he's carrying, even when there are these other aspects that he leaves buried, except for those moments of intimacy where there are little glances.
Yeah, it's intimacy through quoting poems. Well, he lost his father when he was a child, so he remembers his father saying these Zen small poems. So to him, knowing them by heart is a way to not to lose touch with his father. It's like the memory of his father is within these small poems. But on the other hand, it has to do again with dealing with death. Because these Zen death poems in Japan were meant to be the summary for an entire life. Before you died, you had to live your own death poem. And I find it so moving, and it's a very classical thing to do. I mean, it's ars moriendi, the art of dying. So I like the idea that the poetry is the place where we rehearse mortality. And these poems talk about that all the time, but sometimes with a sense of humor, which I love. And two of them are quite funny. And they are real. I mean, the ones that he quotes existed, like
the one about
centuries
plagiarism?
ago.
The one about plagiarism?
Yeah, for instance, yes. This is, this poet who is expecting for his brilliant own death poem comes to his mind, but he's about to die and nothing comes to his mind. So he decides to copy someone else's poem, and since he's someone who's dead already, of course, he won't matter. And he says, this is, I don't remember exactly, but it's something like, this is someone else's poem. I promise this is the last time I copy someone else's poem.
Yeah.
So that was for real a goodbye poem by someone. And the other one is like, I'm going to translate it and not to spoil it. It's something like the student saying to the master, "Oh, master, when you die, where are you going to?" And the master says, "I'm going to the bathroom," and disappears. And the student spends the rest of his life thinking, is this a joke? Does he mean we are bodies that have urgencies, and then when you die, nothing remains, or maybe your soul remains? Does he mean that big questions have only small answers? Does he mean he needs time to take a time to think about it, and when he comes back from the bathroom, he's going to answer? So these no answer, great answers, which are very typical of this tradition, I find it fascinating.
Yeah, that could be a Hasidic legend. I mean,
Yeah.
as well as a great joke.
And it's the mechanism of literature.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
answering the question with a better question.
Yeah. Well, speaking of literature and different reflections on death, I know that both of your parents were musicians, and I imagine that obviously must have shaped in some way your sensibility
Banjos.
toward language and banjos.
Broken banjos.
No, but you mentioned translation earlier, and of course, before events, even when you're familiar with a book, it's useful to look things up. And I had never realized that you translated the Winterreise. So this song cycle by Schubert, which is largely based on a poem, a cycle of poems by Wilhelm Müller, set
Exactly.
mostly in the countryside with an individual and meditating over and over again on social exclusion, but also death.
Yeah.
And I mean, that particular, I suppose this is something that's interesting both in terms of translation as working from German into Spanish in that case, but also the awareness I'm thinking of, like, there's nothing like a song cycle in which, I mean, it has to actually be more than the sum of its parts. It's not simply, for it to be truly realize its potential, the texts and the music meet in a way in which the one heightens the other. I wonder about, thoughts about, this is not even a question, this is, I suppose,
No, but I
me
love the topic of
reflecting,
Winterreise and leads me to all kind of things. Well, first of all, my family, as you said, the profession was the music rather than literature. And in my family, silence were filled with music, if this makes sense. I mean, certain things that were conveyed through music rather than to explanations or words. So the sound of words, when you sing words, made sense to me because this was a way to reconcile both music and literature. And the Winterreise is very interesting because the very first two lines, as you know, is I arrived as a stranger. As a stranger, I live. So you remain a stranger even in your own place, just like Mr. Watanabe, just like myself in my birth country, and shortly afterwards having to exile. So I remain a stranger to my own country. And but I think that the Winterreise has a powerful lesson about the hierarchy between music and words, because when the Winterreise was composed, the famous guy was the poet, Wilhelm Müller. And Franz Schubert was a half-failed composer. I mean, if you compare him to Beethoven or Mozart, he was unknown. And so Franz Schubert felt so honored by the idea of putting music to this famous poet. And nowadays, outside Germany, nobody knows who Wilhelm Müller was. I'm aware that in Germany he's still very well known. But if you say Wilhelm Müller in Mexico or Argentina or Spain, nobody knows who he is. And Schubert is like, you know, like the Beatles, right? I mean, this pop songs. Winterreise is the most famous pop songs. That's what they were. Actually, Leonard Bernstein found a link between the Beatles songs and Schubert songs. And it does make sense, of course. I mean, if you put, I don't know, For No One or Eleanor Rigby and the Winterreise, you will find a link. So, so in the end, music wins always, right? And the melody of words has been like an obsession to me, how to translate a foreign music to some other music. So translation, in a way, is like the perfect and more conflicted way of writing, right? Because translating a text is reading and writing the same text at the same time. So it's the most perfect form, and at the same time it's full of problems, you know, cultural filters, historical misunderstanding, gender conflict, you name it.
I was fascinated by something that I saw in the French edition, because obviously you've lived in different countries and you speak those languages, but it's often the case when an author's finished with the work, they don't want to even see the original again. It's like, I'll read the passage when I have an event, but I'm not going to read my own work, much less, you know, look closely at other translations.
Yeah.
Apparently, with this book, it has changed, it is mutated, it is transformed, almost like a different interpretation as it's been translated into different languages. So there's a notice at the end of the French edition that says that it's been gradually, that you, it's not, and it makes it appear as though it's not even corrections. I don't know if this is another, you know, kintsugi, but can you say something about what kinds of, out of curiosity, what kinds of modifications are you making to the work as it moves from one language to another when you're looking at these edits? This is So this is correct? So the
It's
English
absolutely
edition
correct.
is not, there are things that are
They're
slightly
not
different.
identical.
And it's because of you, it's not because of the translator.
No, it's because
that
of
you're-
me. Yes, I think that the text is never ended, finished. It is a work in progress, means forever, and I think that translation is not just a pale reflection of the original, but it's a second original itself. It's a literary text. I don't think that there's a hierarchy between original and translation, if the translation is good. And sometimes it's not good because it tries to be a reflection instead of being a piece of art. So it must be a second original. It's an original based on a previous original. That's my way of seeing translation. So very often when I get a translation, if it's a language that I can read, like French or English or Italian or some of those languages, I like so much some solutions that my translators have found that I go back to the original, I retranslate it back to my language.
So that the next printing in Spanish incorporates the change made by the previous.
Exactly. So it's a double track process. So every time it gets translated, it gets literally modified, the original. So the French edition carries all the things that I found and learned by reading the translation in some other language. And I think it's beautiful because, as I said, in a way, a translator is a super writer and a super reader, so they know much better than us the books, and I respect very, very much translators, and I think they are the engine of world literature, really. And translating poetry is even more interesting because poetry is supposed to be untranslatable.
Right.
So how to translate the untranslatable, to me, is the big question of literature.
Yeah. And in the effort, something does come through. And there's always that paradox between that which, when you know the language and that you see as extraordinary, and is something that is exploiting the resources of the language.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
that, you can't do that in another language, but then you have a conversation with somebody else, somebody who's read it in a different language,
Yeah.
and they love almost the same thing that you do.
That's
It's-
what I
it's,
like about translating poetry. When you're translating kind of neutral prose, like an easy prose, you can cheat yourself thinking you are translating faithfully. There's supposedly, very supposedly, not essential problems about translating from one language to another. But in poetry, you cannot pretend you can have a literal translation. You have to assume that it's not happening, and you need to invent new effects to the second original. That's why I like translating poetry, because you drop the illusion of the literal or the faithful translation. And it's a creative
It's a
act
recreation.
based respectfully in a precedent text.
In the same way that a piece of music or a piece of theater is recreated each
Exactly.
time by those who
So
interpret it.
you face the limits and the endless resources of the second language in poetry. So it's like exaggerating the problems that any translation has. In poetry, they are like more enhanced, the goods and the bads of the translation. So it's a critical translation, the poetry, yeah.
Since we're inhabiting that space between languages in our conversation at this moment, maybe this is a good opportunity to read a second passage
Yeah,
about
certainly.
inhabiting that space between different countries and identities, and the way that if you do that for a sustained period of time, even the place that you're from starts to feel strange and estranged.
Exactly. Good words game. Yeah. This is a very, very small paragraph about this. Maybe you wanted to read first, and then
Okay. Great.
So
With-
the translation is the original, and I will translate your translation.
With his accumulation of comings and goings, transfers and moves, Mr. Watanabe developed an emotional ubiquity. Each of his emotions was, partially at least, always somewhere else. He had started to feel in harmony. This rootlessness wasn't confined to space. Intimacy with his loved ones became problematic. he no longer knew how to be with anyone undividedly. No sooner had he attained an instant of fulfillment than half of him was already envisaging his next move, going over travel arrangements, planning tasks in distant places. Nor did making those journeys alleviate his restlessness. His other half, no less sincerely, longed for the refuge of home and to lounge about in pajamas on Sundays.
I was thinking about Simone Weil, the French philosopher, who said in Spanish, arraigarse en la ausencia del lugar, which in the translation, the Spanish translation I read, is an endecasílab. So it's a perfect verse, but I wonder what's the original for that. It's like to have roots on the lack of place, of the root of on the rootlessness. So that is what happens in this paragraph. Con la acumulación de idas y venidas, traslados laborales y mudanzas, el señor Watanabe terminó contrayendo el síndrome de la ubicuidad emocional. Cada una de sus emociones, al menos en parte, estaba siempre en algún otro lado. Había empezado a sentir en acorde. El desarraigo no se limitaba a lo espacial. La cercanía misma con sus seres queridos se volvió problemática. Por así decirlo, ya no sabía estar con nadie por unanimidad. En cuanto alcanzaba un instante de plenitud, un hemisferio de su persona ya estaba imaginando sus próximos movimientos, repasando itinerarios, planificando quehaceres en lugares remotos. Materializar esos viajes tampoco mitigaba la inquietud. Su otra mitad, no menos sincera, añoraba el refugio de su casa y no se quitaba el pijama los domingos.
So we're not in pajamas, and this isn't virtual, but it is a Sunday. Good. I want to ask one more question before we open things up to the audience. It's always one of the other privileges of getting to moderate is to look forward as well as, focus on the most recent work. And I'm curious as to, because of course when a work is published in translation, in most cases it had appeared in the original language a few years beforehand, and of course the writer doesn't stand still. Have you been working on a longer fiction in the meantime? How has the past year been for your creativity? In theory,
complicated as everybody else, I think, like feeling that you're supposed to have more time at home, but the outside context had changed so much that the so-called home piece wasn't working the same way. So I had periods where I thought I had more time than ever, and other periods where I thought that I couldn't focus. I've just had a baby also. So it was a revolution. Last year for me was like life-changing for the good and the bad. And so I began a new novel which was interrupted, beautifully interrupted by the baby. And now I only can write short poems about the baby. So the baby is my main and only source of inspiration. And I'm trying to learn from him. I'm learning a lot about him. Because everything seems to be natural for him. It's strange. A baby is such a strange character because on the one hand, he's a boy. He has to learn things that we take for granted, like breathing, eating, or sleeping. So the physiological functions need to be learned. So the natural becomes a learning process. But on the other hand, everything is natural to him. Everything is normal. So he adapts to anything. So it makes me think a lot about the pandemic. So it's been a strange writing period for me, and an observational period as well. And at the same time, I thought that we have two ways of getting to know other places: is traveling and reading. And during the pandemic, only reading remained. So reading and writing proved even more powerful tools. We took for granted that we can travel easily, and we are living in the super quick era, the express tourism. And then again, we were sent back to the medieval times where traveling was so hard, and the only thing you could do was remaining still and thinking. And then again, that was the past was the future.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. I mean, for many of us here, this is the first time leaving our country in 16, 17 months.
And,
right?
and the far away now seems far away again.
Yeah, it does. It does. Well, thank you so much. We have time for questions both from the public as well as elsewhere. Did I see that? Jorge has his hand up.
Oh, can I say something else about the pandemic, just in case this happened to you as well? In the beginning, I went through different periods as a writer saying, I'm not writing about. Then a third period when you say, I think I changed topic and now I'm writing about something else, but then you reread it and it's a metaphor for the pandemic. So you are doing it even though you think you were not. Yeah. So I'm there, I think.
Yes, I was thinking while you were talking about the novel, about the difference, if it is truly important, between disasters that are deliberate, produced, like war catastrophes are generally conceived as something that was wanted by someone against the other, and the earthquakes or volcano eruptions or meteorites, which are not unintended. So do you think that they produce very different effects in people, that their coping mechanisms after a deliberate catastrophe like the atomic bomb and Fukushima are very different, or deep down they are lived the same way because you are all the time contrasting them or comparing them, putting them together in the novel. Fukushima and Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Jorge. Well, in fact, in the book, that topic is directly approached, the difference between natural catastrophe and human or deliberate catastrophe. And on the one hand, it was a very mean maneuver by the media trying not to differentiate both things as if they were the same thing, something that just happens, and something that takes a long political and economical process to happen. So they are essentially two different things. But interestingly enough, in the Japanese case, in 2011, and that's what really struck me, was that both were entangled, because the earthquake you cannot predict, the tsunami you can and can't predict, because, well, I'm going back to this later, but let's say that earthquake and tsunamis are natural catastrophes, but that affected a nuclear plant, and the nuclear plant was not a natural event. It was there for some reason. So without so many nuclear plants in Japan, that tsunami wouldn't have produced such a tragedy. And why a country which suffered, the only inhabited land that suffered atomic bombs, is so full of nuclear plants? And I was saying the thing about the tsunami because apparently the tsunami that hit the coast, the northeast coast in Japan 10 years ago now, it was as high, the waves were as high as a tsunami a century ago. So that had already happened a few times in history. And apparently in small towns in the mountains, there were old stone signs indicating that you shouldn't build a village crossing that line centuries ago. And the civilization forgot all those warnings and dared to climb down the mountains and building closer and closer because they had barriers, technology, and everything. And so the tsunami destroyed entire villages with a wave that was basically the same as centuries ago. And nobody cared about those signs. So I mean, even in the natural disaster, you can link it to the historical knowledge, memory of the past, and of course, an earthquake or a tsunami is not the same in a poor country as in a rich country. Earthquake, with a 9 degree, the Richter scale in Japan is the same as a 6 in a country with less resources. So conceptually, it's easy to distinguish the natural and the human catastrophe. When they happen, political and economic problems overlap with the so-called natural disaster. I don't know if I answered the question. And psychologically, I think they are different because in nature, supposedly what happens, and the political conflicts could have happened differently. So I think the trauma doesn't work the same. With the natural catastrophe, supposedly there's no enemy, but then again, the way that the government prepared for the catastrophe, the way you build the houses, the way you research the past catastrophes. So it's fascinating because I think in a way it's a tool to think about the natural and the cultural. This dichotomy, which in a way at this stage of history is false. Because everything is cultural and everything is natural and they are entangled.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
When you talked about the stones that would be like a warning to not build a village here, it made me think about the earlier moment in your presentation when you talked about the 3 stages of trauma and the fact that, evidently we forget the warnings of history and rediscover again what can nature or human people do to us and each other. Do you think this is an inherent part of the human condition? Do you think
can you repeat
and that the rediscovering of traumatic events through history time and time again is an inherent part of the human condition, or that it is something that we can somewhat escape, and through what means?
Or
if it is something that we can somewhat escape.
Okay, so is it like unavoidable or not, right?
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
it's like a human fate.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a very powerful question. I don't feel, I don't think I'm able to provide a proper answer, even though your question is essential, necessary, and beautiful. But I don't think I can cope with an answer. If we look back to history, we don't seem to be able to learn much, actually. That's why we do tell stories, because it's a very modest and imperfect way to try to avoid that and not succeeding. It's like a tragical way of being aware of our inability to learn, and even though trying it through telling stories. So I think, it's a momentary lapse of lucidity, to almost quote Pink Floyd. It's a momentary lapse of lucidity. The narrative tradition is being aware for a few minutes right before forgetting again.
But that becomes an archive, doesn't it? I assume that while you were working on this book, you read some Japanese literature about the disaster, that you read other forms of literature about other historical moments that felt important for this, right? We consult those archives. It is a living kind of, there are narratives that do endure and and the lessons are within those texts themselves, whether it's from Euripides to
exactly.
the present.
So, more rather than an answer, I think if a book leads you to that question, it has succeeded. regardless the answer. I mean, it's good to go back to that question. I think it's that question. And it's such a good question that shouldn't have an answer. If it makes sense. I sound like a Zen, but I think it's true. Really good questions shouldn't have an answer. And this is what Zen parables teach you. If there's an answer, it's not a good question.
Unless the answer is...
This is a good pretext in a public event, right? Like, oh, your question is so good that I won't answer it. But it's true.
Well, I mean, I suppose that's more polite than saying I have to go to the bathroom, and that's your Zen answer, you know. It's
Yeah. Sadly, I went to the bathroom right before coming here, so I couldn't really...
I think that might be the cleanest and most beautiful ending to this exciting event, because we are out of time. But I do want to at least reiterate that the books are for sale, and Andres is present, and this very rare...
Am I
Which
virtual?
one, right?
This is my first festival since the pandemic, so am I present? Yeah, oh yes, I'm not online. I'm just
You can even sign a book.
Are you there?
You can leave the trace.
Can I touch you?
Which me?
Yeah, we don't need a chat. I mean, the Zoom, we're not pressing a key. I'm excited.
As soon as the conversation is over, whoop, black. It's all done. No, it's... But thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you, Andres, especially, for being here and for talking about this wonderful novel. And yeah, and there's a great program for the rest of the day, so I expect to see many of you at different events.
And I hope you enjoy the questions while you're at the bathroom. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much.